Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages. Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for car insurance can be? Visit Progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life, on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
The new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire. The human postponer. They were the master of one phrase. I'll circle back on that. But 3 months later, you were the one doing all their work and wondering how big that circle is. But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can take the hiring load off your plate by automating the hiring busy work from the initial job post to scheduling interviews. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
I believe in the discipline of mastering the best that other people have figured out. I don't believe in just sitting down and trying to dream it all up by yourself. Nobody is that smart. The more hard lessons you can learn vicariously rather than through your own hard experience or misfortune, the better. They are the words of Charlie Munger. He was Warren Buffett's business partner and spent his life refining mental models for good decisions. Instead of trying to always be the smartest person, he was obsessed with not messing up, staying in his zone of competence whilst also pushing that zone where possible with a growth mindset. And his worldviews certainly worked out rather well for him building Berkshire Hathaway, which became a $1 trillion empire this year. His book, Poor Charlie's Almanac, is considered a staple for any investor, but it's really a book about practical psychology and worldly wisdom, as he calls it. It covers cognitive biases, decision-making, and all the heuristics that we can use to avoid making bad decisions. And that book, covering his worldly wisdom, is going to be the topic of today's episode. So hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me. We are here to learn about the science of behavior with a lens of self-improvement and the goal of helping you build your own philosophy of a life well lived and then doing it. Today, we are using Poor Charlie's Almanac to help us with that. I can't tell you just how much I enjoyed this book personally. It really spoke to my own obsessions with multidisciplinary thinking and how interrelated the dynamics of the world are if you truly want to understand anything. As he says, to really understand the big things, it's the little things that matter, whether that's economics and your investment decisions, or learning how the mind works and self-improvement. I read this book over 2 months ago now, and since then, I have not stopped using some of his advice and wisdom and quoting his mental models to other people in conversation to the point where it's getting almost annoying for other people who know me. So I figured if it's impacted me this much, it's useful for others, and it also serves as a really useful place to send people. One of the important mental models he mentions is that if you don't wrestle a little bit with information that you are given, then you aren't forming your own beliefs, you are just a puppet. So I will take this on board and highlight a few potential flaws or mistakes that people make trying to implement some of the styles of his thinking. And to conclude the episode, I will round up with explaining the final and most important theme of the whole book and my number one lesson going forwards. So stay tuned for that at the end of the episode. The whole thing is going to be awesome. So the first core theme I want to talk about is the concept of interdisciplinary thinking. Instead of treating things individually and having just one mental model for one scenario, Charlie believed in using a lattice of mental models that draw on insights from various disciplines to make better decisions. He says that I could already see that the real world problems didn't neatly lie within territorial boundaries. They jumped right across, and I was dubious of any approach that, when two things were inextricably intertwined and interconnected, someone would try and think about one thing but not the other. Only an interdisciplinary approach will correctly deal with reality. In the same way, you might need to put on different hats as an entrepreneur to make a business decision, not only on the impact of your revenue, but also your brand value, customer satisfaction, time to market, the difficulty for your employees, etc. The decision doesn't lie purely in just one domain, and most decisions in life and investing should use different hats and philosophies to weigh them up, using things like psychology and physics, but also economics and law. Munger called this worldly wisdom and said that the combined output of synthesis from looking from these different perspectives would produce something that has more value than the sum of its parts. Now, this does sound very logical and easy to grasp, but as soon as we start getting into our profession, for example, we can find ourselves trying to use one lens. For example, Charlie was always dealing with people talking about macroeconomics, which is largely the field that he was working in investing, but he said that you can't do macroeconomics without understanding microeconomics or things like human behavior. When it comes to a company, you need to know what incentives a company uses to keep its workers interested. You need to know what are the physical, technical, and legal limitations on the company's growth. What are the routes to market and what moats are held by other incumbent companies? All of these nuances affect just one single company from the bottom-up perspective when trying to think about macroeconomics, as well as then trying to think about the top-down effects of things like interest rates, the economy, and trends of preferences in society. And this is a lens that I really believe in and that I really try to apply to growth mindset, because how can you understand growth mindset without a deep understanding of ego or attachment theory or things like the psychology of fear? Nothing exists in a vacuum. And so that's why on this show, I do spend a lot of time talking about concepts from physics like time and momentum, as well as philosophical concepts like free will and the existential point of life, because that is how you build a growth mindset. So yes, I think I've made the point that interdisciplinary thinking is where it's at. A few of his favorite mental models in this department that can help. The first one is understanding your own circle of competence and knowing the limits of your knowledge. At Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie and Warren would not invest in businesses with too many moving parts that would make it hard to understand what the real valuation should be. They'd concluded that they could never really accurately price a technology company or a biotech business because they didn't have the circle of competence to understand this business versus its competitors. So why should they pretend that they are smarter than they are, when instead they can cut out doing a bunch of work and unnecessary risk-taking by looking at things that they don't understand? Just because you're an investor doesn't mean that you can invest in anything. And some things will have too many interrelated moving parts that you're never going to get to the bottom of with your interdisciplinary thinking. So you want to focus only on businesses that are easier to understand. And yes, this might sound like some fixed mindset thinking. And of course, you can get better at anything you do, but you can't do everything. And actually, if you want to build a $1 trillion business by investing in things, it's more important to stay in your zone of competence than to try and look smart and get lost in the classic shiny object syndrome. This, of course, relates to the next concept, which is the mental model of opportunity costs. Every decision you make has trade-offs. Investing in one business means you aren't investing in another business. Investing in a career or a partner choice means that you are missing out on other ones. And you need to understand what you are giving up to better allocate your time and resources. Many companies will try to invest in 100 different businesses, but there's so much work to truly understand each individual business and its competitors that you create a whole ton of admin or you just don't do the work properly. And this leads to most firms that try this to underperform just a basic index firm. Charlie's company, Berkshire Hathaway, really focused on holding only a handful of stocks with very, very high conviction. They would say if they could make one good decision a year and not have to worry about it for 10 to 20 years, that's a lot less work than trying to reanalyze 50 decisions every week. The final principle here is the Inversion Principle, which has honestly been something I've been thinking about every day since I've read this book. Charlie says the way complex adaptive systems work and the way mental constructs work means that problems frequently become easier to solve through inversion. If you turn problems around into reverse, you can often think better. And at a simple level, mostly Charlie Munger would use this when trying to identify a better strategy. For example, if you wanted to get fit or write a best-selling book or be a good investor, people would generally be looking for rules of how to do it instead of looking for ways that would prevent you from achieving those goals. By using inversion thinking, you look at all the things you shouldn't do and be sure to avoid those. What is everything I would do to not get fit? I'd eat crap, I'd never work out, I'd have bad sleep, I'd be stressed. So primarily, if you just avoid those 4 things, you're probably going to start getting fit. The opposite of a good investor is someone who makes emotional decisions. They invest in things they don't understand, and they perhaps use financial instruments that put them at too much risk. Bad investors often invest in too many things at once that they can't keep up with, or they might put all their money into one risky bet. So there's a list of 5 things you can do if you want to be a really good investor. And for example, 99% of people who invest have never solved that first point, which is the ability to not make emotional investing decisions. So if you can solve just that one, you're already a much better investor. Another interesting example of inversion thinking would be looking at your results and what they mean. So, for example, I recently updated the logo of the podcast on the 1st of July. I didn't change that much else about the show over the summer, and yet by the end of August, my weekly downloads had doubled. Now, that was an insane result. And you might say, wow, having a better cover art doubled your downloads. And therefore, better cover arts will double the downloads of any show. But that isn't true, because there's a lot more that makes a podcast popular than just its artwork, right? So instead, we should try using inversion thinking to find the answer. This show is over 7 years old. I've had a lot of practice making episodes at a regular cadence and consistent quality. So perhaps everything about the show was good enough already for it to be bigger than it was, but I had some cover art that was kind of old, a bit clip arty, and perhaps the cover art was holding it back. So instead of saying good cover art doubles your downloads, we could reach a more accurate inverted lesson that poor cover art will halve your potential downloads, but everything about a show needs to be working for it to grow, and just having good cover art alone would not double your downloads. So it's an easy thing to mess up. So as we see, using inversion thinking just adds some more clarity and rationale behind some easy assumptions we can jump to. Right, now let's move on to the second main concept of the book and Charlie's thinking, which is cognitive biases. He was a really big fan of psychology, and he believed that any course on economics, investing, law, or in fact any university course would be greatly advanced if it involved a module on practical psychology. His main lessons about psychology is that humans are remarkably prone to various biases that cloud our judgment, and he understood that good investing, or good anything for that matter, does require a devotion to clear thinking and using any tool you can and any mental model to encourage rational decision making. Now, on the subject of cognitive biases, I have done a whole season on them. It is worth a listen if you want to deep dive into Daniel Kahneman's work on fast and slow thinking, which helps us explain where cognitive biases come from, and then a very thorough analysis of over 35 different cognitive biases that do exist and will be making you stupider every day. Well, that season is for you. It is in the show notes. But the 3 biggest biases he refers to in the book are, and his line of work are, number 1, confirmation bias. We tend to seek information that supports our preconceptions. If you own some Bitcoin, you're more likely to consume information that will convince you it's a good idea to own Bitcoin. Women and men will inherently agree with a rogue science article that will explain that the opposite sex to them is more narcissistic and immature than their own sex. It seems so obvious that people are making the mistake when we look at it from a third point of view. But the issue in the moment is that as you read something, you think you're finding the truth, and so you really have to assume that your gut reactions are probably quite dumb, and that you do actively seek out information that challenges your beliefs to avoid narrow thinking. The only way to think clearly is to understand every flaw in your thinking instead of ignoring them, so you should be much more obsessed with anything that could prove you wrong, as opposed to reading things that confirm your beliefs. A brilliant example of beating confirmation bias is Charles Darwin. Now, he paid really special attention to any evidence or experiment whose results didn't match up with the theories he was trying to put forwards. If a result disconfirmed something that he believed and loved, that meant he had more work to do to find a better theory that could explain everything, as opposed to having a bunch of holes in his theory. And it's so easy for scientists to ignore the data that doesn't make sense or conflicts with their theory, as it is for all of us. But when we ignore real conflicting evidence, we're not creating knowledge or finding truth, we're creating false beliefs. So it's very annoying, but after a while it becomes fun, and routinely picking up on disconfirming evidence is required in life to maximize correct thinking. If you can get really good at destroying your own wrong ideas, Charlie says that is a great gift. The next bias is the authority bias. Now, it's just human behavior that we follow authority figures quite blindly. And it can, of course, lead us to poor decisions. Authority figures could be people or more widely sources such as news sources, political parties, clubs and hobbies, maybe podcasters you like listening to, or social media influencers who you find yourself agreeing with and liking their posts, so you watch more of their posts and so on. And when you find a source where you believe everything they say without questioning it, that is actually a warning sign. For example, it's good to have conversations with books or information sources about why it might not be the complete truth. Most people, most of the time, do have an agenda. Politicians and company owners are probably the worst at this. The amount of billionaires who are suddenly saying Trump is great and Kamala will ruin the economy don't genuinely believe that Trump is a wonderful human being who will treat everything fairly and wonderfully. They believe that Trump will give them much less tax, and they're falling into their own confirmation bias to find reasons why he must be great, so that they can ultimately have less tax and more money. And if we were to listen to them all, we would then be suffering from authority bias. Anyway, this is getting in danger of me having some form of political opinion, which I deliberately try to avoid, and I'm certainly not saying you should vote one way or the other, as I am not here to place my opinions on you or anyone else, because it is way out of my zone of competence to say what is right when I believe it's my job on the podcast to present different mental models and tools from science to help you make decisions in your own life rather than make them for you. And to be honest, when it comes to the political spectrum of left or right, I'm pretty much in the middle. But I would just generally say that it's a bad idea to trust the political opinions of billionaires because they definitely don't have the same incentives as normal people. All right, final cognitive bias is social proof. As much as we follow authority figures, we also follow just the behaviors of others and groups around us. We can't see the culture we grew up in or how influenced we are by just other people's general behavior. We have to really fight to build our own independent thinking instead of mindlessly following the crowd. A funny phenomenon you notice is people actually try to overshoot this and instead do the opposite of anything they see in the crowd. And that can lead them to following conspiracy theories behind everything, which is also not ideal. But there is a real problem when we all follow the definition of what people think is best for everyone. And you can see problems right now. So many people go to university to get an education that will allow them to get an office job, and 10 or 20 years later, they'll have a midlife crisis and retrain to become a carpenter or a florist or anything that doesn't involve sitting behind a desk for 8 hours a day, because that was never something they actually wanted to do. And we grow up being told that a respectable job is a knowledge job economy, and so we accept it. And then a lot of people that have gone down that route waste a long time working out that it was never the route for them, and it isn't the right answer to follow what everyone else tells you to do, because they didn't have time to work that out for themselves beforehand. So yes, don't be a black sheep, but also don't follow the crowd. And then to round up his general opinions when it comes to cognitive biases, Charlie talks about the fact that he doesn't trust himself or anyone with an opinion who can't argue the opposing view better than the opposition. He says he has what he calls an iron prescription that helps me keep sane when I drift towards preferring one intense ideology over another. I feel that I am not entitled to have an opinion unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people who are in my opposition. I think that I am only qualified to speak once I have reached that state. And that's a really, really cool idea that most people never follow, but is worth trying on for yourself. Okay, we are going to have a quick break before I outline some of the mistakes people make trying to follow Charlie's rules and any weaknesses in his arguments that I've spotted myself. And then I'll round it all up with the best parts of his philosophies and my main take-home. Have you ever replayed a conversation for hours, desperate to know that a friend doesn't secretly hate you? Or maybe you kept researching a minor stomach symptom even after your doctor had reassured you that you weren't about to die. Well, yes, we can all get stuck worrying a bit sometimes, but these examples could be signs of OCD. It's an issue that's often mischaracterized as liking things neat and organized or turning the lights on and off 3 times. But OCD is actually about getting caught in distressing, unwanted thoughts and feeling driven to do something about them. Maybe check, research, seek reassurance, just so you can feel completely certain. OCD can latch onto your relationships, your identity, morals, health, and your own sense of reality. But the good news is that OCD is highly treatable with specialized therapy, ERP or exposure and response prevention, and that's where NoCD comes in. NoCD, is the world's leading provider of virtual OCD treatment. Their licensed therapists specialize in ERP with face-to-face sessions and support between appointments. They're also covered by insurance for over 138 million Americans, so visit nocd.com to book a free 15-minute call. That's nocd.com.
If you want all of your data in one place, you need the Intuit ERP. I'm Damon John, and I run my growing business on Intuit Enterprise Suite. Learn more at intuit.com/ERP.
Hear that? That's now Crispy and McCrispy strips meeting Creamy Caesar sauce. Sounds extra crispy. Caesar sauce at McDonald's for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Right, on the topic of arguing against your sources of information and not absorbing beliefs without question, I will do the same here and look at some of the weaknesses in Charlie's mindset before we arrive at the best part of his overall theory and lessons to take forward. Now, this wasn't easy, I have to say, due to Charlie and Warren Buffett's insane focus on being as rational and unbiased as possible. It does make it quite hard to argue against them. After all, we just learned that he tried to argue against himself wherever possible. But I still have 3 ideas. Firstly is that their dedication to rationality and lack of emotion leads to a lack of emotional connection or potential and exploration of artistic areas. Mostly, as he says, good investing is achieved through removing emotion. Sure. But I think wonderful pieces of art and many startups require a suspension of belief which allows for the sorts of breakthroughs that humans can achieve that wouldn't occur if we just relied on computer-like decisions with no room for error. For example, Elon Musk famously tried to get Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger to invest in Tesla, which may well have been their best performing investment that they ever made if they had invested at the time. Of course, Tesla was very much against that thesis, being a technology company with many unproven elements at the time, so it was an instant no. Likewise, Berkshire Hathaway never invested in Google for much the same reasons. However, you can kind of understand this. By following the rules they had, it kept them in safe investments that earned them 20% a year for over 50 years, and that is a nuts result, which meant that they could afford to miss those styles of investment. But I still believe there is a weakness here because if everybody followed their rules, the world would be a boring place. Another qualm that I have with his thinking is that he puts so much work to be binary that it can lead to him paradoxically falling into some cognitive biases. Charlie spent his whole life with the stance that he would either know everything about something or know nothing. And I felt like sometimes that made him too adamant in his competence in some areas, whilst conversely too adamant in his incompetence in other areas, which is inherently a fixed mindset. And like I did say earlier, you do have to choose your battles, and it makes sense to not waste time at all in an area that has too much change in decisions like technology. But there's something about his dismissive tone towards technology, cryptocurrency, and quite a few other areas. And it does feel like he does genuinely have some confirmation bias of his own opinions here, and this has blocked some of his potential curiosity that is otherwise his greatest strength. Then my final point here is because he spends so much time saying I'm completely right or doesn't know anything, he can sometimes come across a little bit arrogant and like he believes everyone around him is stupid. It feels like he has this inbuilt assumption that everyone is wrong about almost everything and will be making lots and lots of mistakes. And to be fair, this is mostly a genius assumption, as it's kind of true, and by looking for the mistakes other people make means that you don't make the mistakes yourself. And the strategy did work really well for them. If you look at other investors over the years who were putting all their time and effort into making as much money as possible, and yet didn't perform as well as Warren Buffett and Charlie, because they were using these mental models that made them relentlessly look out for the mistakes of others. And I'll further ruin my own point here by saying that this is a trait that you see in the memos of many other high performers like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or even Mr. Beast. In fact, Mr. Beast's recent guidebook for working at Mr. Beast Productions is a really, really good read. In it, he can't stress enough the definition of a good job and taking ownership of not letting mistakes happen. In fact, it's basically a 35-page booklet about how to not make mistakes. Whilst I'm talking about it now, I'll give you an example. He says that if you're trying to produce a shoot that's going to start in 45 days, In the first week, there's not much you can do apart from get a creative to write the script of a video, right? But that is a bottleneck before you can do anything else in the rest of your 45 days, which are ticking away. And people normally hand the idea over to the creative and they check back 1 week later, expecting it to be done. But what happens if 1 week later, surprise, you find it's not done? That's not the creative's fault, he says. That is your fault. You could be checking in every day. You could be telling them that this is your bottleneck and could be costing the company millions of dollars if it's not ready, if you end up being 1 day behind on a shoot schedule that is already booked in. If you fail to get that script back in time, you are just making excuses if you blame someone else. And if the whole company had that ethos, because there's so many moving parts, everything would be behind schedule with no one taking responsibility for anything, and it would become a burning pitfire of chaos. He says specifically, I want less excuses in this company. Take ownership and don't give your project a chance to fail. Dumping your bottleneck on someone else and just walking away until it's done is lazy. It gives room for error. And I want you to have a mindset that God himself couldn't stop you from making this video on time. Check in daily, leave no room for error. Now I'll bring this all back. On the one hand, yes, that is a genius strategy. But on the other hand, it does feel rather arrogant. Telling people exactly what to do and what does and doesn't work can be kind of controlling and miss out on the opportunity for the brilliance of others or potential upside surprises when you just have a very dismissive expectation of how others behave. When you look back at Berkshire Hathaway, a reason they didn't invest in startups was that they believed that ultimately you're relying on the smartness of the founders, and that's an unknown variable, so you shouldn't invest in startups. I would agree that the smartness of the founders is an unknown variable, but if you use his own principle of inversion and deliberately invest in founding teams and thus invest in the smartness of founders, that is exactly what you will see the best startup investors of all time doing, like Y Combinator, Andreessen Horowitz, and Naval Ravikant. It's made them billionaires. So personally, although I agree that there are lots of mistakes going on everywhere all around you, you should try to remove error, I also like to try and think more positively about other people and have more faith in them, because personally I do, and maybe that isn't a good opinion, but I feel like I can very much make both sides of the argument at least, and it's a bit of a paradox that for me, both are true. And with that vague conclusion, that rounds up my poor attempt at poking holes in Charlie Munger's philosophies, and we will move on from my own weaknesses here to the final theme of his mental models. Okay, so the biggest theme running through this book is simply the concept of rational decision-making. As I've already mentioned, everything in your life is basically the result of your decisions. You could counteract that and say that it's also about your execution and hard work, which it certainly is, but you should make decisions that align with your level of ability to execute and how much dedication and hard work you're willing to put in. You could decide to be an actor, for example, because of your brilliant talent. But if you're not willing to hustle or suffer rejections, you thus fail as an actor, so it's a bad decision to pursue acting. There's this wonderful definition of intelligence, which says an intelligence is your ability to get the results you want. And I think it's completely on point. Intelligence requires you to navigate complex decisions like life choices, investments, making space, and that means you have to make some space for logic, reasoning, and clear thinking, which we have been talking about extensively today. However, outside of the themes we've already discussed, there are some mental models that he relies on that don't fit into any other box besides just the box of rational thinking, so I will talk about those ones here. The first is appropriately called first principles thinking. It is a mental model made quite famous by Elon Musk, where he says we can spend too much time looking at complex problems with a bunch of underlying assumptions about things being the way they've always been, instead of breaking things down into their fundamental core truths and then building up from there. One of the best examples of how he has applied this is when you look at building rockets. The cost of the actual physical rocket itself, the engines, electronics, boosters, etc., that cost is 100 times more expensive than just the fuel that is used to launch it. Thus, reusable rockets could make space travel much, much cheaper. It is a very hard thing to do to build a reusable rocket, but it is worth solving. There is no law in physics that says a rocket must be destroyed after it has been launched. It's just what has always happened until SpaceX decided to try and land a space rocket. And there are lots of things that we accept without thinking about the real laws of physics and what is truly correct. Just because Apple stock has always gone up and up, there is no physical law that requires it to keep going up. Just because you've always eaten a muffin in your break, there's no physical law that requires you to always eat a muffin. It's exactly the same for emotions. Anytime you get embarrassed or angry in a situation where you always normally feel those emotions, there's no law of physics saying you have to get embarrassed or angry right then. It is actually possible for you to change the emotions you feel. Doesn't mean it's easy at all, but when you use first principles, it allows you to see what are your assumptions and offers you potential routes to think about solutions, to start thinking about solutions or what decisions you might make. Next, we have a concept called probabilistic thinking, or as Annie Duke calls it in her book by the same name, thinking in bets. As we know, life is filled with uncertainty, but we could try thinking about decisions based on the concept of probability rather than imagining that there is certainty, because there isn't. It's annoying and just doesn't feel intuitive to us, yet that is the nature of reality. For example, if you are told there is an 80% chance of rain today, you take a raincoat and umbrella with you, and then it doesn't rain. And you think, well, the weatherman's a bit stupid, I've carried all this around. But 80% chance doesn't mean the rain will be a heaviness of 80%. It means that 8 out of 10 times there will be rain. And so the prediction is correct, and twice there won't be rain. Equally, looking at the opposite version of that, a weatherman saying 20% chance of rain, that might lead us to say, we definitely don't need a jacket. And then we get soaked because there's a huge downpour and we curse the weatherman for getting it wrong. Yet he literally just said 2 out of 10 times there will be rain when he says 20% chance. And this is the flaw of thinking in certainties instead of probabilities. And when we can wrestle this into our head, how to think in probabilities, it makes it much easier to project into longer term thinking what is a useful decision or not, and to understand how our risks work. I would genuinely say that Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets, is a really good book to dive into. I did have her on the show a few years ago, and I did also do a review of her book last year, if you are interested. Anyway, on the subject of risks, there is another complementary mental model called the margin of safety. This was originally a financial concept, but it applies to all decision making. Whether you're Napoleon packing extra rations for your troops to prevent a campaign being completely lost, or Mr. Beast booking an extra day on a shoot in case of setbacks, because for him, if a shoot isn't completed during the expected timeline, the entire multi-million-dollar shoot is wasted without having that extra day to finish up the content, along with backups like the possibility to rent the crane or tank or whatever stupid thing they are doing for that extra day. It's exactly the same with all your investments. You need to allow some room for error and uncertainty. It protects you from all the unforeseen risks that always exist. We totally know that things like house repairs often take twice as long and cost twice as much as we expect. If we don't have a margin of safety, we might start rebuilding our staircase and run out of money with a half-complete and unusable staircase, which isn't the scenario you want to end up in life. Okay, now onto the final mental model. Drum roll. This is an epic principle made famous by Richard Feynman, who says that there's a difference between knowing the name of a thing and truly knowing a thing. And Charlie Munger defined this as chauffeur knowledge due to a story about Max Planck. After Max Planck won his Nobel Prize, Max went around Germany giving the exact same lecture on the new aspects of quantum mechanics. And side note here, it feels strange to call Max Planck simply Max. Sounds a bit rogue and rock and roll compared to the scientific and Germanically precise Professor Planck. Anyway, over time, Max's chauffeur, who had seen the same lecture over 50 times now, he had memorized every word of the lecture. So he said one day, "Would you mind, Professor Planck?" He wasn't on first name terms with him. Because it's kind of boring and repetitive for both of us to stay in the same routine, what if I gave the lecture in Munich coming up and you just sit in the front of the theatre wearing my chauffeur's hat? And Max Planck said, why not? In Munich, the chauffeur got up, gave the long lecture on quantum mechanics word for word, After which, a physics professor in the audience stood up and asked a perfectly ghastly question. The chauffeur, however, dressed as Max Planck, said, "Well, I'm surprised that in an advanced city like Munich, I get such an elementary question. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to reply." Thus, the real Max Planck got up and answered it. Certainly an amusing story about how the chauffeur deflected the question, but it makes the point that, as Charlie says, we have two kinds of knowledge. One is Max Planck level knowledge, that is, people who really know what they're talking about. They've paid their dues, they have the aptitude. Then you have chauffeur knowledge. They've learned the prattle, the talk. They might even have a big head of hair. They often have fine timbre in their voices and can make a good impression. But in the end, all they've got is chauffeur knowledge masquerading as real knowledge. They don't know what they're talking about. I think this is a great point to end on because it's so easy to read a book on relationships or listen to a podcast on investing, memorize your lecture notes on marketing. But in the real world, when you're called to use that knowledge, do you know how to use it? The art of becoming smart, achieving your goals, requires practice. You're going to have to accept that you will have some failures and embrace a willingness to iterate and improve and keep on putting yourself out there. We have learned a ton of mental models today, which are all incredibly smart ones that you could use, and it genuinely might change your life. But simply knowing them won't do very much. You have to practice them. So get out there and start trying to apply them to your life. Thank you so much for listening. If you do have a friend who makes terrible decisions all the time, you know who I'm talking about. Dating the wrong people, have a habit of investing in things that are at their peak and then fall off a cliff. Maybe they look like they were dressed by their nan. Well, do them a favor, send them this episode because sharing is caring. Also, if you have smart friends, you could also share this episode with them because you can talk about how to apply these mental models within each other's lives and decisions that you make. As Charlie says, "In my whole life, I have known no wise people over a broad subject matter who didn't read books all the time. None, zero." So on that, go read some more books. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause. Silence. To reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.